we're going to start with now. Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Argentina? Atlantis? Australia? Yes.
Go back 70 years, 1947, I was the first year in high school. Not really involved in what was going on in the world because no one at that age is really interested in all that kind of stuff.
I was in a kibbutz. I was about close to a year in Israel when they announced the United Nations. But the same day, we were shot at, okay, from all over.
Well, I was 3 years old when we came to Barbados, so I had finished my bar mitzvah. Very much aware. My father was a staunch, I wouldn't say Zionist, but in support of Israel.
Well, in 1947, I was 11 years old, so I was not politically astute at that time, but I did know what was going on.
I was 18 years old, okay. I was beginning my third year undergraduate at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, New Brunswick. I was precocious.
I was born in London, yes, in 1940. There was no talk in our house of the state of Israel when I was a young boy.
The UN vote was in favour in 1947, and by that time I think I was in my second year at Oxford actually. And as best I can, well, I know we were pleased, of course.
At that time, I was in Toronto. I was very serious with my husband at the time, and he was more involved because he was in the service. He was in the Air Force during the war, and it meant a lot to him. I would have been 19.
I went to England with a Kindertransport, and I came to Canada exactly a year before the vote. Northern Ontario. My late husband was a mining engineer, and I invariably in mining towns was a minority of one. These small mining towns, as they know here, I'm stubborn, knew more about Israel than the average small town. And it's the only thing that I could do to make a difference as far as telling people what it was all about.
Honestly, that's a distinct memory. You know, we're talking about many years ago. You know, we're talking about 7 years ago.
Mine was a very different experience. I was still in primary school. We lived away from a Jewish community. The nearest, we were affiliated, but not only living there because of my father's work. He was a family doctor in a coal mining area in South Yorkshire.
Total population of the town was 30,000, and there were about, I guess, 150 Jewish families. So it was a small community, so we were really the only ones interested in what was happening.
We managed to escape Europe in 1944 with a tiny little boat. About a year later, we managed to get to a place that now is a wonderful, thriving place called Givat Shmuel. It was full of orange groves and sand.
I was in Israel. We were about 16 kids. We studied 4 hours Hebrew, 4 hours we worked, and then 2 hours they teach us how to fight. I learned to throw a grenade with oranges. They announced that we got a country, so everybody came out and we danced the whole night, and they gave us candies and chocolate. The first time in my life I had a chocolate.
Well, it was a small Jewish community. There were a couple hundred families. My family were not part of, they were hard-working sort of people. They didn't belong to the organizations.
I was brought up in more of a Zionistic family rather than a religious family. even though there was no such thing as, there was only one type, you were either Jewish or non-Jewish. You were Orthodox or nothing.
In those days it was pretty insular. It was the radio station, the one newspaper, and that was it. So I've always been a news hound, and that hasn't changed. I don't remember what day. I remember listening to the radio.
My family was a member of the Jewish community in Winnipeg, which is was then and still is a very large community, and was very politically active. Oh, it was on the radio. It was a very big thing. It was on the radio, and I remember we listened. I can't remember what time. It was probably during the evening, I think, when the vote took place. This is what I recall.
It was, if I remember, like we were listening constantly. It must have been interjected with other events that were going on, you know, regular programming that was going on.
I just started grade 1, and it was Shabbat, and I had a friend who lived over the sand hill or whatever, over yonder, and I decided to go and visit her. I guess my parents were sleeping or something, or doing something else, and I didn't tell them where I'm going. I came home, but they were really upset because they were looking for me all over. They couldn't find me. You know, they were worried about the vote. They were worried about all these kind of things. So my father took me, and boy, oh boy, did I get a licking. And I was bawling, and I was crying, and I was not fair, and everything else. And then the vote comes, and excitement, and the vote, and yes, we won.
In Barbados, again, my father was instrumental in all this. We obviously heard from the rest of the world and the British broadcasting overseas service. We had a shortwave radio, and we sat around the table and we all looked at the radio. We also made a list of the voting. So we actually went down the line as people were voting in New York. We could hear it in Barbados, and we made a record of it. And so we knew when the State of Israel came into being.
I was actually at home.
Okay.
I was at home. We were listening to the news. Yes, my parents were too, but somehow I was communicating with my husband at the time, wondering, you know, what he heard, and getting his take on it.
Well, we were members of the Jewish Society at the university in Oxford, and we were very much taken up with it. Don't recall whether I heard of it first on the radio or read it in the newspaper. I do recall that the moment it happened, we knew about it.
My parents were the ones who knew that there was something going on at the UN. I mean, most of the adults knew it, the Jewish adults in the community. So my father told me, well, you know, there's going to be this thing happening at the UN. They might recognize the State of Israel. They might make some vote in order to establish it, some preliminary event, and it's going to be on the news. So, and the news, most of the news that we got was either through the newspaper or the South African Broadcasting Corporation. We sat down and we listened, and of course we're very concerned about how this was going to turn out.
Because I emphasize not to allow anybody to interfere in our business.
I imagine my parents probably did know because they would see it in the papers. And I'm quite sure my relatives in the bigger cities knew about it. Certainly a couple of my mother's sisters were active in these local Zionist organizations.
My family consisted of my father, an aunt, and another brother. They had lost 7 of their siblings in the Holocaust in a shtetl in Poland. My aunt, whenever we talked about family, tears would come to her eyes. And then the State of Israel was announced. From her standpoint, she said, it's too late. It's too late for my family.
We had 4 hours of teaching, so every morning the teacher told us that today will happen this and today will happen that, and we were waiting and all that. And in kibbutz, they taught us already how to fight and everything, even when the English were there, and they used to come at least once a month and check if we have ammunition.
I was in a residence, the Lord Beaverbrook residence, and there were maybe 2 other Jews in the residence. And There was no Jewish fraternity on campus. There was no Hillel. So essentially, I was in an ivory tower at the university when the announcement was made. I barely even knew about it at that time.
United Kingdom, the same. United States, yes. Uruguay, yes.
We made a list as the people voted, yay, nay. We made our list. So when it came, I forgot the exact, when it came towards the end of the vote, the state of Israel became into existence. And there was a big hurrah. Before then it was, I'm sure the other community members were all listening on their own shortwave sets. And then we got together, we had a home, we didn't have a synagogue there, but they had a large home, one of the families, and everybody collects there, lots of food, lots of everything, and lots of things to drink as well.
The vote was positive, the vote, everybody was, you know, and then he took me and hugged me and kissed me and threw me in the air. And boy, I just was very confused. I didn't know why. First he licked, first I got a good licking, and then, you know, this kind of thing. And then everybody went out on the streets, and the excitement and to see everybody with that kind of, you know, sure, I was a little girl, but there were other little kids, there were other people, and everybody was saying, we have a country, we have, you know, it's ours, we do.
My father, like he's Scotch, he had his, you know, and you know, I don't even remember talking much about it at school the next few days. It was something that happened far away, and we were not connected to the world as we are connected today.
It was sort of depressing that my family couldn't make it to Israel.
We were very happy, and we went, I think, I have a vague memory of being out walking and meeting friends and being on the high street in Oxford.
Oh, just incredible. You know, everybody was hugging each other.
I had no one to have a party with. I was relieved, and that was it. Didn't have the forethought to realize how difficult it would be.
Loudspeakers, and they announced, and the music started, and they opened everything. We could eat anything, candies and chocolate and cookies that we never saw. And we danced about 4 or 5 hours till the shooting camp started from Nazareth. That's the way it started. So about 2 weeks after, they took us to the army. I and another girl, we were 15, okay? So they said, you don't have to go. So I said, till I'll be 18, there won't be any war, I'm going, and the other one went too. So when the fighting stopped, I got a letter from Ben-Gurion. Thank you, children, go home and enjoy yourself.
A committee was formed in 1947 named UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. 13 countries of the approximately 55 countries of the UN sent delegates to this committee. Canada's delegate to the committee was Supreme Court Judge Ivan Rand. When I was at the law school, I belonged to a Jewish organization on campus called Hillel. The people at Hillel asked me if I could arrange for Judge Rand to speak. So I went down the CV and I read it so that I could properly introduce him. And it said, Canada's delegate to the UN Special Committee on Palestine. I'm talking over 50 years ago, and I was a kid at the time, right? But he generally talked about, he mentioned the fact that Arab countries were invited, but no Arab countries showed up.
It was still fairly respected in those days. I don't think we respect the UN anymore, but it was respected then.
I was waiting to hear the votes, especially Russia, because that was a key country. If Russia went positive, then a lot of other countries would do so as well.
And I remember somebody saying, and just Ken and I, that we were surprised about the Russian vote. And then afterwards, because I'd always been in contact with Israel and whatever, became Israel, somebody saying they did it dafke, just an eye against Britain. That's why the Russians voted for partition, because they really weren't too fond of the Brits.
And it's really interesting to think about it because there's a similar problem this year in the United Nations. Russia can swing the votes back and forth depending on how things are going.
And it was quite tense. So when it became clear that the State of Israel was going to come into existence, it was just fantastic.
It was like a history that was that big. We were lucky to see it a reality.
It was exciting because you just didn't know. I mean, this was something new to us, to hear something like this taking place and to actually be almost participating in listening to it, because South Africa was sort of a backwater. We didn't really participate much in what was happening in the world. We were doing our own little thing. And especially for me, just as a schoolgirl, as I say, we never spoke about it at school.
As a child, I remember planting trees with little orange buds on it. And they would tell us what it is, and this is what we hope for. And for me, when this happened, it was like a childhood dream and a childhood expectation that came true.
We were kids. What did we know? We just knew that the English are bad because, okay, I wasn't in the army, I was in Palmach. And Yitzhak Rabin was my commander.
The UN at that time stood for something, and it made it official and it made it legitimate. If the UN had voted against, there wouldn't have been much of a chance. Because I think that vote legitimized Israel's claim to be a country.
Yes, it was momentous. It was a moment in history. We'll see what comes. There's a lot to be done yet. You know, this is just the beginning.
You know, to me, it's still a miracle. That's it.